All right, we are back with hermeneutics, and we left off on sensus plenor, which carries the idea of the double authorship. Gave a few examples there. Daniel chapter 12, verse 8, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 10 through 12. And then some prophecies may not have been fully or even dimly understood by the author who penned them down. Examples there would be Daniel 8, verse 27, John 11, 49 through 52, and in some cases the prophet may have had an understanding about the meaning of their prediction, but maybe not the full scope of its implications. Then we moved into, to recap where we left off last week, the 7 steps in lexical syntactical form. Number 1, identify the general literal or literary form, the genres, poetry, prophecy, etc. 2, trace the development of the author's theme and show how the passage under consideration fits into context. So remember earlier we talked about theological analysis. That comes handy here, and that of course consists of essentially comparing a given text with all of the other texts given on the same subject. Number 3, identify the natural divisions of the text. That would be, main conceptual units, transitional statements, and conclusions, and so forth. Number 4, you have the connecting words within paragraphs. What are they? What are the connecting words within the paragraphs and sentences? And that takes you, of course, into grammar, conjunctions, and prepositions, etc. Number 5, determine what the individual words mean. Over time, various words take on different meanings. So what did the word or words mean during the time the author penned down a various sentence, argument, gospel, and so forth? 6, analyze the syntax. That is the relationship of words to one another that is expressed through their grammatical form and arrangements. And then finally 7, put the results of your lexical syntactical analysis into a non-technical, easily understood form or words that clearly convey the author meaning, his meaning of or meaning to the general modern English reader or whatever language you're teaching in. All right, here's a fun exercise from Paradise Lost. Moving on now. Of man's first obedience or disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, or woe, with loss of Eden till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heavens and the earth rose out of chaos. Now on 21, slide 21, you will see this excerpt from Paradise Lost. On 22, I'm writing in the blanks at the end of what this could possibly mean. So if I were to recap, of man's first disobedience and the fruit, that seems to refer to Adam. Trying to do hermeneutics here, it's very hard to be exact and precise and correct, of course, because people have gone back and forth as to what this means from Paradise Lost. Of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste, what could that refer to? Tree of knowledge, good and evil, brought death into the world and all our woe. Brought in sin, that seems to be the case here. What about with loss of Eden till one greater man? Was that the idea that there's a Messiah, or that the garden was guarded till one greater man? With loss of Eden till one greater man. All right, move on. Restore us and regain the blissful seat. That seems to be reconciliation to God. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top. You can figure out what that means. I have my doubts. Of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire, probably the law of Moses, and then that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. That shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. allusion there maybe to Abraham and more. In the beginning, how the heavens and the earth, of course, Genesis 1:1, but then at the end, rose out of chaos. That is not biblical. We believe in ex nihilo creation there, so it looks like, I believe it was, who was it that said? I think it was Hirsch, who says this is a Christian humanistic epic in a blank verse. So there you have some issues of hermeneutics that you can look up on your own. All right, on speech. Speech in general, writing, or just talking, concerning meaning and interpretation. Speech is, quote, not just simply the expression of meaning, but also the interpretation of meaning. Concerning speech and delivery, I remember a law professor years ago, he said here, words coupled with an effective delivery will communicate and persuade. Words coupled with an effective delivery will communicate and persuade. This is not only true of speaking publicly, but it's also true of writing. And boy, do we all need work in those areas to try to convey to the best of our capability what we mean. And of course, when we disclose that information, we're also interpreting our own writing as it's delivered. And of course, the aim is to make sure that the listener or the reader or the student fully understands to the best of his capability what we are talking about. All right, what about some other critical assessments? Does the text change? As is claimed by the radical historicistic school, the text can mean different things for different individuals. Thus, the text can and do change, it is argued. It is argued that the text take on a different meaning every time it is read, not just for the new reader, but even for the old, repetitious reader. One example, of course, here, as popularly put, is his story versus history. The historian interprets events and more. In turn, he or she produces an account of given historical events that he or she believes to be historically reliable or plausible or true. But did the historian interview all the players involved in the historical setting and events? Of course, they didn't. So does that mean that all of history is his story, the historian? That is, of course, a big issue in the science of interpretation or hermeneutics as well. So moving on here, that the argument, the author oftentimes does not know what he himself means. Interesting here is, here it's argued that the text just doesn't change for you as you're reading the text. You go back and reread it, and it takes on a completely different meaning. There's no magic in the words. This is where we need to try to get back to what the author originally had in mind. What was his intent? What did he mean to communicate? Now, Immanuel Kant, of course, claimed that he understood Plato's ideas better than Plato himself. That sounds rather cocky, but this is the true description. No, it isn't, because Plato definitely knew the meaning he sought to communicate, while Kant has his own interpretation of Plato. Now, Kant even went so far as to claim that Plato himself did not understand what he himself wrote. All right. On the other hand, it may be true that Kant understood, here's the distinction, the subject matter better than Plato himself. But this is entirely different from the author not knowing what he himself meant when he wrote it down. All right? So therefore, the subject matter is different than that of what the author meant, given the subject matter in his or her historical setting. In other words, we know more about bats today than, say, Socrates did. Bats now, the animal, the bats is the subject matter at hand, but let's suppose that Socrates did write about bats. Well, we can be sure that whatever he wrote about given the world of bats in his day and what he attempted to communicate, he actually meant that and knew the subject matter well in his day. Even if today we might know more about bats than Socrates did. So the subject matter of bats or ideas, you name it, this is therefore not a case for what they call authorial ignorance, ignorance of the author. All right, so it is thus argued that the texts take on a different meaning or meanings every time that it's read, not just for the new reader, but also for the old reader. One example I stated earlier would be his story versus his story. I got to move on here. We're now on slide 24, 25. I'm going to move on to 26. And let's see here. All right. One solution here to all of this. I'm talking now in context of subject matter, the author not being here. Did Kant know more about ideas being a subject matter than, say, Plato, etc.? One solution in looking at a document is what we call a shared meaning, the shared meaning approach. You know, what is the consensus? But that does not mean the consensus of modern scholarship, liberal theologians, evangelicals, depending on who you read, is correct either. So we have to be careful there, hence the syntax that we discussed earlier. All right, what about further critical assessments? You have accessibility of verbal meanings. First, if it were true that the author did not think that his ideas are or will be correctly interpreted, the author probably would not write his own ideas down in the first place. No point in writing a book, a novel, a scholarly piece, an article, unless you believe that what you're actually penning down and trying to communicate is not going to be understood by the listener or the reader. So, having said that, the author obviously believed, I'm not going to say assumed, believed for good reasons that the reader would understand his work. Now, according to Hirsch, quote, "It is far more likely that an author and an interpreter can entertain identical meanings than they cannot." You can find that in Validity Interpretation, page 18. "What we must deny is," he continues, quote, "that linguistic signs can somehow speak their own meaning." We must deny this. In other words, there's not a, quote, mystical idea that has never been persuasively defended. Let me read that again. We must deny that, quote, linguistic signs can somehow speak their own meanings. A mystical idea that has never been persuasively defended, unquote. And according to Hirsch, the argument that changing cultural conditions change the meaning of a text assumes that the object of interpretation necessarily changes the changed conditions. I'm going to say that again because you don't have the slides yet. The argument that changing cultural conditions change the meaning of a text assumes that the object of interpretation necessarily changes the changed conditions. So that is a strong assumption. You know, cultural relativism and all of these things, and applying it to postmodernism and texts in particular, the Gospels, of course, you're all over the map now. So this is why these things are important. And I can't stress Validity and Interpretation, E.D. Hirsch, H-I-R-S-C-H, Jr.'s work, and also Hermeneutics by Henry Virkler, V-I-R-K-L-E-R, Principles and Processes of Biblical Interpretation, in addition to the textbook that the school chose for you. All right, let's move on and briefly talk about the logic of validation and probability. Now, on validity, validity, in the logical structure of arguments, I've said this before, we look for what we call three things: validity, truth, and soundness. This is a little bit of logic right now. So, validity, truth, and soundness. What does valid mean? Well, you have an argument, and so we have to make sure that we have a valid structural form. A valid argument would be all men are mortal. Socrates was a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So the conclusion follows from the premises. Now, if you made up an argument where premise 1 says, the color blue sleeps faster than Wednesday, and then premise 2, and therefore, etc., the argument might be valid, no matter how bizarre the premises are. But validity is not enough. We want true premises. So when we say validity, truth, and soundness, truth means that the premises are true. And of course, that's what we're after. We're not just after a valid argument, but we want the truth of the argument. The premises have to be true. And so a sound argument, validity, truth, and soundness, validity means that the conclusion follows from the premises. Truth means that the premises are true. And a sound argument is where a true conclusion follows from true premises. If you have true premises, inescapably you will have a true conclusion as well. It follows from the premises, etc. So, a validation, now, when it comes to hermeneutics, has to show not merely that an interpretation is plausible, but that it is the most plausible. All right? That's Hirsch on page 171. A validation has to show not merely that an interpretation is plausible, seemingly true, but it must be the most plausible, the most seemingly true. And that is, of course, very interesting when you enter into theological discussions, theological debates, and so forth. And he argues here concerning correctness. Correctness is precisely the goal of interpretation and may in fact be achieved, even though it can never be known to be, in other words, fully achieved. We can have the truth without being certain that we have it. And in the absence of certainty, we can nevertheless have knowledge of the probable, So the above is not only true of writing in general, but true of all the sciences, biology, geology, you name it. All right. Now, we're going to enter in next to history of hermeneutics, but first I want to mention hermeneutics that is tied to theology or theologies. In the liberal theological think tank, you will roughly discover that there are theologies but no theology. Or due to there being so many theologies, I myself have no theology. You'll notice that in some of the liberal theologians. Verkler puts it here, liberal theologians typically, quote, view Scripture as a product of the evolutionary development of Israel's religion. All right? So the liberal approach is typically they view Scripture as a product of the evolutionary development of the Israeli religion, or of Israel's religion. He further argues, as Israel's religious consciousness became more sophisticated, so did its theology. Consequently, liberal theologians see in Scripture a variety of theologies, writings that reflect different levels of theological sophistication, sometimes conflicting with one another. Rather than viewing the Bible as God's truth revealed by God to man, they believe Scripture to be man's thoughts about God, hence theologies. Since men's thoughts changed over time, there you have it. They believe that Scripture reveals a number of theological ideas and movements as they progressed in their sophistication about theology, rather than as a single, unified theology. As such, they tend to see biblical history as discontinuous, with lesser emphasis on unity. This slide is very important. That's on 28. This will sort of kick off where next we will look at various views throughout the history of hermeneutics, from ancient up to modernity. And we will resume on that in our next session. Meanwhile, stay blessed and keep up the good work. Shalom.